Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Ariel Levite, and Ariel is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the Nuclear Proliferation International History Project. He's also a senior fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Policy, or Peace, I should say. Previously, Dr. Levite was the Principal Deputy Director General for Policy at the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission. He also served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Defense Policy and was head of the Bureau of International Security and Arms Control in the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He joins us today to talk about nuclear threats and concerns related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ellie, thank you for joining us. Great to see you.
Pleasure. Thank you, John.
So let's divide in half the nuclear power plant risks and then the potential for actual use of nuclear weapons. And beginning with the power plants, what we've seen at Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, how dangerous were these situations? How dangerous are they as the conflict continues?
Well, I don't think that they're on the same level of severity, the two power plants facilities that you mentioned. In general, power plants that are currently operational, and those are the lion's share of the power plants, are ones that face the greatest risk of environmental and safety problems if the crews are unable to monitor their activity and some of their power supply is disrupted. And clearly we are facing a very acute situation there, that not only did the shelling threaten to cause damage to some of the facilities, but also to disrupt some of the power supply. Bear in mind that in the previous power plant crisis that we've had in Japan, in Fukushima, the trigger was a tsunami, but the process was one where it was simply losing power to cool off the reactors, and the various backups were failing one after the other. So clearly the shelling was a major source of problem. With the multiple facilities that you have now in Chernobyl, the biggest problem is that the fuel rods that have been there require constant sort of cooling, and the constant cooling is being monitored by staff that both lacks adequate communication, adequate rest, adequate backup power supply for weeks and weeks and weeks, and they're even barely getting enough food. So we're dealing with a situation that their capacity to be alert, to monitor temperature changes in the cooling of those rods is increasingly endangered. So there, although a lower order of magnitude, there is a significant potential the thing could go wrong.
Russia's willingness to take these risks, do you chalk it up to recklessness, incompetence, or is it purposeful?
Let's put it this way. Let's disaggregate between the various elements that may be going through the Russian minds. One is, why are they getting into the proximity of those nuclear power plants? They want to get a handle on those nuclear power plants so they can control the power supply for large population of Ukraine. Number one. Number two, they clearly are ones that are trying to displace the Ukrainian control from some of the most important assets in Ukrainian possession. So they've been doing it with respect to cities, and they're doing it with respect to nuclear power plants. How they go about it, I assume, has less to do with, let's say, premeditation and more to do with a measure of combination of incompetence or lack of attention, or a combination of the above.
So beyond the risk of a nuclear accident at an energy producing facility, which I don't want to suggest is minor, but perhaps even more startling is all of the nuclear saber rattling we've been hearing from, whether it's Putin himself or Medvedev or others in the Russian hierarchy. How concerned should the world be about this at this moment?
Let's distinguish three clusters of concerns. One is a concern where they actually use it. The second is what it is they're communicating by invoking the nuclear threat. And the third is what type of a legacy is left behind after the dust settles on the Ukraine conflict. Okay, so let's take them one at a time. If we're talking about the first one, I don't think that their likelihood of use of nuclear weapons is high. Apparently, the use of chemical weapons, potentially biological weapons, is much higher. Radiological weapons, perhaps, and so on. But I think the Russians aren't going to use nuclear weapons, certainly before there is, unless and before there is a massive NATO intervention on behalf of Ukraine. So that's one. But two is quite important, namely the Russians are trying to signal that they're dead serious and they're not going to back down easily. And they're also trying to tell NATO, watch it, because this could escalate in that direction. So clearly the signaling aspect is very important. By the way, not the first time Russia invokes it. It did it again in the Ukrainian crisis in 2014. But to be perfectly honest, other nuclear superpowers have also used similar signaling mechanisms in other crises, except that here, this is mainly used as a cover to warrant an invasion or to facilitate an unopposed invasion. The third element may be the most worrisome of the lot, namely in the long term, that is, namely trying to convince everybody that nuclear weapons have a significant utility and that you're actually facing such existential risks and that others may not be willing to come to your rescue is, I think, maybe the worst possible legacy that would emerge from the Ukraine crisis, strongly amplified by the fact that the Ukraine gave up on the nuclear weapons in its possession that were Russian in origin on the basis of security assurances given by none other than Russia, UK, US, and even China, all of which obviously proved to be hollow when it came down to the crunch.
Where is the world right now in terms of nuclear security? Let's even say independent of the Russian invasion and these latest, at least rhetorical escalations. You know, for a generation who lived through the Cold War, there was a constant concern for this catastrophe taking place. And then it seemed to drift into the background for the last several decades, perhaps in a way that illustrates a bit of complacency that was ill-advised because threats were still out there. So when you look at the big picture of efforts for non-proliferation, hotspots like whether it be North Korea or Iran, how do you characterize the general environment as it relates to nuclear security?
Just to clarify, we're talking security, we're talking safety. Those are two very different issues.
Well, help us with the distinction. Let's talk about both and tell us how we should distinguish between the two terms.
The security issue mostly had to do with whether mostly nuclear power plants and depositories of the nuclear spent nuclear fuel and so on would be in jeopardy. Okay. And here, after going through major accidents in some of the most sophisticated possessors of nuclear technology, namely in the US and Russia and Japan, all resourceful countries with significant nuclear knowledge and experience and so on, the world was visibly shaken and had considerably tightened the safety of operations of nuclear power plants. What many countries had concluded was that nuclear power was too risky to sustain, so they began to phase it out. Germany is now basically finally phasing out the last 3 of its nuclear power plants which were in mint condition, for example. And furthermore, there were some efforts to tighten the standards of some of the nuclear power plants that remained in operation or ones that would be built in the future. It hasn't gone as far as it could have because we're talking here about modifying nuclear power plants that have been around for 60 years. In some cases, their life would now be extended to 80 years. But in general, the sense was we're moving in the right direction overall. Where the issue becomes quite prominent is if we're now looking at the possibility of a nuclear revival as a result of the transition towards a less dependence on fossil fuels to reduce global warming. And here, the potential is for nuclear power plants to proliferate to many countries that do not have the kind of resources the US, Russia, or Japan had to deal with nuclear crisis. And so even if the safety standards that have existed would have been deemed to be sufficient in the future, we're dealing here with the necessity to further enhance the attention to nuclear safety. Because we're talking about power plants that some of which will be even closer proximity to population centers, for example. That would be in remote area where you can't extend much help, like in Siberia, where the Russians are deploying floating reactors and so on. We're talking now about nuclear power plants powering some satellite activity, which is another cause of safety issues. So we are having here a need to revisit the safety provisions that have been in place to protect such facilities and such uses, including in the hands of those who are less sophisticated players. So that's one cluster of issues. That's essentially the safety issue. There is also a safety issue of nuclear weapons, but that has largely come around a great deal. And the number of possessors of nuclear weapons is quite small at the end of the day and so on. Clearly, we're nervous about what happens, for example, in North Korea, and we don't know much about nuclear safety of its arsenal. Namely, what are they trying to prioritize? Command of the leader, readiness, or safety? And those are quite good questions, particularly in a country where its infrastructure is so decrepit, as is the case in North Korea. So that's with respect to the safety. The security agenda has been put in front of our eyes by President Obama through a series of summits devoted specifically to security. With the greatest anxiety there is that unauthorized people will gain access to nuclear assets and put them to quite worrisome use. And that had gained significant momentum during the Obama's term as president. Since that time, some of the momentum is continuing, but clearly not at the same level of effort as when the US president was pushing that agenda.
When whether the influence is direct or indirect, how do you anticipate that this will affect the negotiations on a potential new Iran nuclear deal? I should tell our viewers, as you and I have this conversation, we've been monitoring the situation in a way where in some reports indicate that a deal could be imminent. Others say the deal could break down at any moment as well. So there is some uncertainty as we record this conversation. But in terms of influencing those negotiations, does the invasion change the calculus?
Well, the negotiations were not doing particularly well, regardless whether they would have yielded some return to the JCPOA, because clearly the benefits of the original JCPOA were hard to realize again, given the amount of progress Iran has made in the interim. It has also become clear subsequently that the issues that were not attended to in the nuclear deal, namely the regional issues with Iran, were outside the scope of the original agreement, and having an agreement now with Iran that frees a lot of resources and essentially binds the US not to impose more sanctions, also puts on a sort of the regional issues in the centers of people's attention. But that is before the Ukraine crisis. I think what the Ukraine crisis does is largely plays to the hands of those in Iran and elsewhere who are saying, look at President Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, the leader, gave up on its nuclear weapons program and ended up dead, and his regime collapsed. Look at Saddam Hussein, exactly the same thing. The contrast with Kim Jong-un and his father and grandfather is quite palpable. They haven't given up on their nuclear weapons and they've survived. There were a lot of people in Iran who paid close attention to it. They said, security guarantees might make the difference. If we accept security guarantees, we can give up on the program. Look what has happened to Ukraine. And this is an extremely alarming prospect. It's an extremely alarming prospect because what it suggests is that the chances of walking back North Korea or stopping Iran completely from pursuing nuclear weapons are quite dim.
Does the invasion trigger a new arms race in the sense that we've seen Russia use a hypersonic missile and have made a lot of claims about the lethality of that technology? Is China now forced to respond in kind?
Well, the Chinese have been dramatically increasing their nuclear arsenal already. They have been doing it for various reasons, including their perception that their arsenal is a lot more vulnerable to US conventional arms and to US missile defense. So the Chinese have already been in the process of upgrading them. So have been the Russians. But to be perfectly honest, so has been the United States. In short, a sort of an arms race is something that we've already seen between these three for quite a few years now, and it looks like accelerating. The big question now is what happens to those who are caught in between. So US allies who feel that in order to solidify US security credentials, they need to do more in order to make the US security commitments more credible. Germany, as an example, that has been dragging its feet on modernizing its dual-capable strike aircraft, has now finally decided to cross the line and do so. Finland and Sweden, that have stayed out of NATO, are now reviewing their security posture, including possible NATO membership and so on. All of this in order to try and get security guarantees. So we have here those who are worried that unless they have security guarantees, they have to get nuclear weapons. And those that do have security guarantees but feel that they may not be credible enough, and they need to propel the United States and others to give them more assurances, in part by things that they would do themselves to defend themselves.
You have a new piece out on the Carnegie website, co-authored, called "Averting a Nuclear Dystopia." And within the piece, you propose a new nuclear responsibility regime and 5 elements to that. Could you tell us what that structure would look like, and also maybe handicap what's the interest in it? Do you think that global leaders are ready to sit down at the table and come up with a plan that would create less tension moving forward?
Well, I think the reason the Wilson Center had given me a fellowship to do a little bit of research in this area has to do with the fact that it's quite easy to be pessimistic about the chance of doing anything these days in this realm. So my point of departure is not a particularly optimistic one. With that being the mindset, the question I was posing together with my colleague Toby Dalton was, can something still be done to avert a nuclear catastrophe? And can it be done to avert a nuclear catastrophe of proliferation, of use of nuclear weapons, and of danger to nuclear power plant facilities? We then kind of made 2 premises. Premise number 1 was nuclear power plants are not going to go away. Perhaps there will be more of them because of climate change. And nuclear weapons are not going to go away because countries hold on to them, and maybe even more countries will wish to have them. With those premises in mind, the question we were posing to ourselves was, can we still do something? Can we still identify a common denominator? And that common denominator would be something that would be able to overcome the toxic relationship between the US and China and the US and Russia, and so on the one hand, between those who possess nuclear weapons and those who do not possess nuclear weapons, and between those who like nuclear power and those who vehemently oppose nuclear power. So we have 3 sets of countries here, and those create enormous difficulty in trying to promote any norm that would be universally adhered to. So what we tried to do was to distill some principles that, if adhered to, would make a difference. And on the other hand, to try and see who can we bring to the table based on their vested interest, most of the key players being those who possess nuclear power plants or wish to acquire them, and those who are on the receiving end of nuclear weapons guarantees and those that possess nuclear weapons. And that's where the package came from. The package is essentially an idea to try and say, whereas there will be some emphasis on priority between the various principles, if you package them together, there is a great deal for every one of them there. And so that is designed to enhance the appeal of that package as a package to try and avert a nuclear catastrophe.
Where will the leadership come from in this regard? Who is most motivated to take the lead?
Well, that's a very good question, which doesn't lend itself to an easy answer. Because if the US were to take the lead, clearly someone else would oppose it, like China and Russia, and the other way around, and so on. So I think that the history of these things is that we need to get some other countries that typically are not as large and clearly have some diplomatic clout and some expertise in nuclear matters and so on. Our thinking was that because of the role Japan plays this year in the context of the G20, Japan may be a useful player to try and promote this agenda. So that's one example. In other types of security settings and so on, it's been countries like Norway or the Netherlands or Switzerland that have been in a position to try and promote this kind of an agenda.
Well, Ariel Levite, thank you very much for today. And I would highly recommend the article that we referenced on the Carnegie site. Like you did in this interview, in the piece, you make a increasingly important issue accessible and understandable, and lots of common sense ideas that we can only cross our fingers that people are listening, right?
Thank you very much, John, for giving me the platform to elaborate on these ideas.
A privilege and a pleasure. Thanks for joining us. To our viewers, hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.